Welcome back to No Enough Projects. Today we are back on the 1.8 BP Miata motor rebuild. Last time we got the short block together. This time we're hopefully going to be getting everything else on the motor and getting it ready to be put back in the car. So I think we can go ahead and start off by getting the cylinder head installed, and then after that we can move on to the timing belt. Alright, so hopefully by this point we already have the deck clean, which in this case we do. It's just oily, which is fine, keeps it from rusting. So we need to clean all that oil off. You can use lacquer thinner, or brake cleaner, or acetone, whatever. And then we need to get our cylinder head, the deck surface, also clean. Another thing we need to prepare is our head bolts. So I'm going to be reusing the stock head bolts. They're not torque to yield, so it's fine to reuse them. A lot of guys replace them with head studs. We're not doing anything crazy here. It's mostly just a stock rebuild. Maybe we'll put a little bit of boost in the future, but we're not doing anything crazy. So we're going to reuse them, although it is good practice to always check your head bolts for stretch if they're not torque to yield. To do that, you measure this width and compare it to the rest of the bolts. And in our case, all of these bolts are about 9.95 millimeters, plus or minus a couple hundredths of a millimeter. So all these bolts look okay. If you had one that was much thinner than the others, then you know that it's stretched, and that could happen either from overheating that messes with the bolt temper, or just the bolt was over torqued, or it's been reused too many times. Who knows? But in our case, all of these are good. So we're going to want to make sure the threads are all really clean, and we're going to want to thread them into the block and make sure they go in by hand really easily, or else we're going to have false torque readings. Alright, our bolts all threaded in okay. Let's go ahead and do a final clean on the deck. You see how much junk it's pulling up? We want that to come out completely clear. Alright, our deck's clean now. We definitely don't want to forget our dowel pins. It's just to make sure that the cylinder heads are located to the block properly. Alright, and here is our cylinder head. Fresh back from the machine shop. It was pretty beat. It needed new guides. All the cam bearing journals needed polished from all the metal. Let's see what else needed surfaced. You know, the usual stuff. But it's definitely worth doing. If you don't have a good cylinder head, then your rebuild's kind of for nothing, because if your cylinder head isn't sealing, then it doesn't matter what kind of condition your bores or block is in. So you can see we're freshly resurfaced here. The surface is nice and fine. We're using a multi-layered steel gasket, so you don't want any roughness. If you're using like a composite gasket, like on a lot of V8s and stuff like that, the gasket's a lot more forgiving of surface finish, but in our case we want a nice, almost mirror-like finish for the multi-layered steel. We just gotta wipe our oil off. I like to use the air gun just to blow off any lint from the towel. Looking good there. Not a bad idea to rotate the motor so that all the pistons are partway down in their bores. Even though this isn't a non-interference motor, meaning the pistons technically it shouldn't be possible that the pistons can hit valve. But it's good practice. Do one final look, make sure you're not missing anything. Now you might be wondering, if you're not familiar, what this staining is, and it's not really a big deal if you can't feel it. It's just kind of a witness mark basically of where the gasket was, and especially usually around the cylinders where the fire ring on the gasket is, you'll see discoloration, sometimes around the water jackets. It's just the pores of the cast iron pick up that color. I don't know exactly what it is, but as long as you can't feel it, it's no big deal, because engines can't see, they can only feel. And if it's as smooth as the rest of the surface, it's not going to mess up our seal. Plus the machine shop checked the deck. We're golden. If you're doing this at home and you're just kind of trying to do a budget rebuild, you can get straight edges. I've got one that are fairly cheap, but they're accurate to like half a thousandth or something across the whole straight edge, and you want to check across the deck in a few places and make sure there's no warpage with a feeler gauge. Usually the blocks don't warp. I don't think I've ever seen a block that warped. Well, other than like a Subaru block. But usually these cast iron blocks don't warp. The cylinder heads, though, on the other hand, they warp like crazy, especially if they get hot. So definitely check that out if you're just trying to do a budget refresh. In our case, we're good to go. Alright, so here's our gasket. Should be pretty obvious the way it goes. Say that as I flip it 10,000 times. There we go. So you just want to make sure all the coolant ports have, well, passage through the gasket. And one confusing thing that sometimes a lot of people get tripped up on, the coolant ports don't get full flow through the gasket. The gasket actually kind of acts like a metering device for the coolant, especially in some V8s and stuff. Some of the coolant passages are actually fully blocked by the head gasket, and that just makes sure that the coolant flows evenly through the head, because if it was totally open at all points, then it would kind of just tend to flow right here from the inlet to the outlet of the water pump. Having it metered and having the passages neck down through the gasket, make sure that the water's flowing all the way through the block back to the water pump. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but as long as all of the holes are lining up, we're golden. Looks like this gasket only goes on one way, just based on the asymmetrical nature, I guess you could say. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and plop our cylinder head on. We want to be careful not to drag it across the dowels. Don't scratch up the deck. There we go. Set down. Let's drop some bolts into it. Alright, so we're going to want to make sure all these bolts are well oiled on the threads, on the bottom and top of the washers. If you don't oil it, then you're not going to get the right torque reading. And I'm just using normal 30 weight oil or whatever. If you're using like head studs or something, well, usually if you're using head studs, you're going with ARP. And they have a special moly lube you're supposed to use. The same one we used on the connecting rod bolts. And that really reduces the friction. So actually when you use that, the torque that you apply is significantly less than if you're using motor oil. Because with motor oil, you're having to overcome a lot more friction. Alright, and these are all 12mm 12 points. I like to use the speed wrench to run them down. Lets you feel how the threads are doing. Now, I'm just noticing something I do not like. There's a bunch of pockets of metal shavings in the head. And I should have noticed that before we started putting it on. But the machine shop said they cleaned it. I guess that goes to show you should always double check. Yep, unfortunately this head's got to come back off. You can see that should be aluminum down there. That looks like metal. Steel. Not good. There you go, there's a whole bunch. So yeah, we're going to have to take the head back apart and clean it. Alright, so I'm going to take the cylinder head apart and clean it. Take the cams out because you can see mostly down on the, what is that? Mostly down on the intake side in the oil returns, we're pretty chock full of metal. Down in that darkness is, well, a bunch of metal. So you can see down there too. Over here on the exhaust side we're pretty clean. But we'll still take the cam out and give it a flush because any of that circulating around to the engine is going to tear up the bearings. I mean, it probably would be fine, but not good. I mean, you could probably get away with it, but it's definitely not going to be a good thing. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that. Alright, I took the cylinder head back to the machine shop. They were surprised they missed that much stuff, so they took it back apart and cleaned it. Now I think we're looking okay. A couple areas of discoloration, but it's kind of just discolored metal more than anything. It's not like shedding any metal anymore. So we don't have those giant pockets of metallic-y oil. So I think we're good to go. Go ahead and get the head gasket back on and finally get the head on. Alright, so we're shooting for a final torque of 60 foot-pounds. The order is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Just like that. We're going to work up to 60 foot-pounds in stages, so we'll first go to like 10 foot-pounds, then like 30, then 60 or whatever. I'll probably go 20, 40, 60. Might as well. Now if any of the bolts are like stretched beyond where they're supposed to be. They'll feel kind of weird as you're bringing them up to spec. It'll feel like they get looser as you go. And if they start doing that, then the bolts need replaced. These ones are all feeling okay. Alright, so with our cylinder head on, we are going to have to put a little bit of RTV on these front caps where the seals go. Go ahead and take them out, and we got to obviously torque down the camshaft. You can actually see where the machine shop had RTV, but they didn't put any new stuff down, so we're gonna have to. Alright, I'm gonna clean up the surfaces. Alright, so we just need to put a real small smear of sealant across this surface in between the bolt hole and where the seal rides, otherwise we might have leakage. Just real thin coat. We don't want it to squeeze out into the bearing surface, so don't want to overdo it. Go ahead and lubricate all these bolts. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and run them all down, just basically finger snug. Gonna try to work our way outwards from the center. Alright, they're all just like finger snug. They get torqued down to 100 to 125 inch-pounds. So we're going to work our way. Alright, now we can put our cam seals in, so we're going to want to lube up the lips of the seals, like all of them. And we want to work the lip over the cam without folding it over itself. Same for the other seal. Try not to get cockeyed like that. I don't have a socket big enough, so I'm going to use just a piece of like flat bar stock. Gently tap it in until it lays flush with the face of the cylinder head. Alright, so next we can go ahead and get the thermostat housing on. So you want to replace the O-ring on there. Throw a little bit of lube on the O-ring to help it seal. And the torque spec on these is 14 to 18 foot-pounds. 12mm bolts. Alright, so now we can get our water pump in. I went ahead and replaced the old one with a new Gates pump. Hopefully that does okay for us. Alright, these also get torqued to 14 to 18 foot-pounds. We also need to put this little rubber seal on that goes between the top of the water pump and the lower side of the thermostat or water outlet housing. The seal's got two sections. I got this wider one that's going to go up into that, and this thinner one that's going to press onto the pump. So this is how the seal goes on. You can see this lip goes like that. Now we can go ahead and get the backing plate on the head. So we just got to hook this little thing back behind the water pump. And these aren't critical bolts obviously, so we can just snug them down. No need to torque them or do anything crazy. Alright, now we need to get our cam sprockets on. So both sprockets have an I and an E marking because you can use them on either cam. So on the exhaust cam, we're going to want to put the E lining up with the cam dowel, and then the opposite on the intake, obviously. Alright, so we're going to use some thread locker on the cam bolt threads. Okay, so we're going to use a wrench to hold the hex that's cast into the cams, and then we're going to torque the bolts here on the cams to 37 to 44 foot-pounds. These are 14mm bolts. So we'll go ahead and turn both of these to where they need to be. Approximately. Alright, now we can put our idler and tensioner pulleys on. This is our idler pulley. I put a little bit of Loctite on the bolt threads. So this dowel pin here is where the tensioner pulley slots into. Just like that. And then we need to put the spring on. This one, the Loctite doesn't really matter that much because we're going to be leaving it loose for now anyways, because we got to leave it loose while we get the belt on. So we can torque the idler bolt to 28 to 38 foot-pounds. So our tensioner spring hooks around this stud right here. It's got a little groove that the spring wire slots into. Then we can just use a screwdriver or whatever to slot down onto the pulley, or shoot the spring across the room. There we go. So for now we'll pull this all the way out and just snug the bolt up just to keep all the tension off the belt until we're ready to tension it. Okay, so now we need to turn the crankshaft all the way to top dead center. Cylinder number 1. So we want to get the crank keyway straight up and down, close as we can get it. Just take our bolt out, which is turning the crank. That's alright. Get it close. Okay, so now we need to get our belt on, but before we do that, we need to put our crank pulley on. Now, like I noted before, the crank keyway is kind of wallowed out on this crank, unfortunately. I didn't notice it before I went to the machine shop, and they didn't notice it either. So I'm going to have to pay special attention here. The keyway shouldn't take any load. It shouldn't bear any of the force from the crank turning to any of the pulleys. This is a common problem on these Miatas because of the way the crank's designed. It's not tapered, and what happens is if you're not really careful about torquing the crank bolt, then it can back off, and then all of the rotational force is then transferred to the keyway. The keyway ideally is just for alignment on assembly, and then the stretch of the bolt is actually what provides all of the clamp force that holds the pulley in place. At some point in this engine's past, the previous owner probably did the timing belt and torqued it against the clutch, like he put the car in gear and torqued the crank bolt that way, and what you're doing there is you're actually compressing the springs on the clutch, because the clutch has springs on it to kind of soften the engagement, and if you torque it that way, then you don't get an accurate torque reading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put Loctite around the snout of the crank and in the keyway, and make sure that it's all the way that way, because this side of the keyway is still okay. So as long as I make sure it's aligned to that side and torque it, then we'll be okay. This one is actually really mild compared to how some of them end up. Some of them, like the keyway, doubles in size. This is just a little bit, it's got a little bit of play. In those cases, you can do like a Loctite epoxy fix, where there's a special Loctite that actually holds the key in semi-permanently. I don't think we're going to need that for this, so we'll go ahead and just slide our pulley on. Try to line our keyways. I also went ahead and got a new key and crank bolt just because this has issues. If yours looks perfectly fine, then there's no need to replace either of these. So here's the old key versus the new key, and you can see the old one's actually beat a little bit. You see there's light in between. It's bent just a hair. So there's two ends on the key. You see one side has a slight taper on it, or a bevel. The other side's straight. So the bevel goes back because the end of the keyway is beveled on the crank. So we'll just go ahead and stick the key in there. And you can see there's not much play here, but there should be 0, and we have maybe a 1/16 of an inch. So as long as I keep it all the way counterclockwise, if I preload it counterclockwise before I tighten the bolt, actually that'd be clockwise, I'm facing the opposite direction. then we're going to be fine. So I'm not worried about it. I almost forgot to put the Loctite on. Already degreased both surfaces. It's going to be important. Otherwise the Loctite's not going to really take. Okay, so now we'll just temp the belt in here. Well, looks like the kit sent me an incorrect timing belt. So that's awesome. So I gotta go get a new timing belt before we can do this. Alright, so luckily I was able to get the right belt local. So I'll go ahead and just loosely put that on for now. We should put the inner part of the crank sprocket over the key. Like that. Get our new crank bolt. Use some generous Loctite on here. Definitely don't want this bolt backing out. Alright, and then I have the crank locked with 2 flywheel bolts threaded into the back of the crank, and then a bar against the engine stand to hold it tight. And we're going to torque the crank bolt to 122 foot-pounds. Alright, there we go, 122 foot-pounds. It's a pretty significant amount. So now we're going to go ahead and rotate the crank to where the mark on the timing sprocket lines up with the mark on the oil pump. Oh, gotta take the bar out. Duh. And the bolts. Okay, so you can see that our marks are lining up. So that means that we're at top dead center for cylinder number 1. So now what we need to do is turn the cam sprockets to where they need to be. We already have them pretty close. Temp the belt on here. Alright, so we want to make sure the E tooth with this little mark in here and the I tooth with this little mark in here line up with their respective letters on the head backing plate. So we're a little bit off, so I'm going to get a wrench and we'll turn it. So we're going to have to hold the intake cam in position while we do this because it's kind of on a sloped part of the lobe. So it's wanting to spring back. And we just got to fish the belt on. And we want to make sure all of the slack is on the tensioner side of the belt. Looks like we might loosen the tensioner even a little bit more. There we go. Now that the belt's on there, and we've got more tension over here than we do over here, which is what we want. We're going to go ahead and verify that all of our marks are still where they need to be. It's pretty dang close. This is certainly not the best timing system I've ever seen. I mean, the actual system is fine, just the way that you actually time it. Usually there's like a mark that's a lot more distinctive. This is kind of vague, but you can also count. There should be 19 teeth in between the marks on our cams. So if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're actually 2 teeth off, believe it or not, even though it looks pretty dead on. Part of it is we still have this tension up here, or the slack is up here, I mean. So take some tension off. Alright, so now we have our timing set. So you can see the mark. So you can see the eye mark on the exhaust cam lines up with the eye ridge right here. And it's the same thing on the intake cam. And another way to check is that we're going to count 19 teeth in between here, which we do have. And that's counting with this tooth on the belt as 1, and that tooth on the belt just to the inside of that mark is 19. So now we can go ahead and set our belt tension. One more check we can do real quick before setting the tension is if we rotate the crank through 4 full revolutions, and 4, our timing marks should line up again. And they do. So now we're good to go ahead and set the tension. So we'll loosen up this 14mm bolt for the tensioner. See, that lets it ride free. Let the spring pull it tight. There's a second mark on the oil pump right here. We're going to turn the crank to where the timing mark on the drive pulley lines up with that mark. You can see the reason why we set it there is because the only place where there's slack in this position of the crank is on this side. Now I can go ahead and tighten up the tensioner bolt. And it gets tightened up to 28 to 38 foot-pounds. Alright, now we're ready to put all of our timing covers back on. Ideally, you'd replace these seals. They're not critical, they're just meant to keep dust and stuff out of the timing belt area. I don't have new ones, so we're going to reuse these, they'll be good enough. And this lower cover is kind of mangled. You can see whoever did the time belt last, not only did they mess up the crank tightening, they also cracked this. And one interesting thing that I noticed is you can see the time belt's all worn right here. And this is the plate that goes right here. You can see it's also worn. So what was happening is the crank was wobbling. The crank damper was wobbling and it was rubbing against that cover, wearing away the paint on this and also wearing plastic away on that. That's kind of a telltale of a loose crank bolt. Who would have guessed? So hopefully we've got that all good now. So go ahead and slip this over. These covers take these 10mm headed bolts. Kind of got to figure out which one goes where. Alright, so I believe this bracket here, whoops, with a shorter bolt goes something like that. We also have a shorter bolt over here, and the rest on this lower cover are longer bolts. These just need, you know, snugged up. Not very tight at all. We've got our upper cover. Cool, there's our timing cover. Alright, now we can go ahead and get our crank and water pump pulleys placed back on here. So we'll start with this trigger wheel for the crank sensor. It's got a locating dowel. And the actual damper or pulley itself. It's held on with 4 of these 10mm bolts. I'm going to put Loctite on them just to keep them from backing out. And then these get torqued to 109 to 151 inch-pounds. And we want to draw it on nice and even. Same deal with our water pump pulley. These don't need to be too tight. Just snugged up, really. And then the Loctite will make sure they're retained. Alright, now we can go ahead and put our crank trigger, or crank sensor on. I forget exactly how this goes, honestly. So the crank sensor actually sits like this. I was thinking that end was the sensor end, but it's not. I don't think this is the factory bolt, but yeah, 3 washers. It's wet. Was on there. Yeah, they must have had to drill out and re-tap the oil pump because that's not the right bolt. Luckily I had a bolt that should do it for us in the stash. Had to cut it down a little bit, but that's alright. So we're going to have to set the air gap since it's only retained by one bolt. I believe the spec is 20 to 59 thousandths of air gap between one of the little trigger teeth and the sensor. So we're just going to use a feeler gauge and we'll shoot for 30 thousandths. So just turn it to where, tie this up for a second. Alright, so I turn it to where the tooth on the trigger wheel is just about centered in the crank sensor. Then I've got a 30 thousandths feeler gauge here. I'm just kind of hold it gently. Snug this up. Try to hold it in place so it doesn't turn while we tighten. Looks like we're at about 32, which is fine. That's within spec. So now we'll want to turn the crank and check at all the other points, which should be the same, but you never know. Looks like we're good. And to secure the harness, we gotta actually take this bolt for the upper timing cover off. It should sit like that. There we go. Now before we start putting things like the water crossover and other stuff that goes on the side of the engine back on, we need to put our core plugs back in, which honestly we could have done way back after we painted the block. So, but we've got access to everything still, so let's go ahead and start putting them in. So I already cleaned out all of these bores with sandpaper and degreaser, and I'm using brass plugs because they don't rust out. They also look a little nicer than steel plugs. I like to use a little bit of non-hardening sealer. I think Permatex calls it Forma Gasket, and you can also get it as Indian Head. So we just need to get something to drive that in flush after we coat it. So you can see how this stuff is kind of goopy. A lot of people install these dry, which is fine. Some people use RTV. I use this stuff. Never had a problem. Just helps seal any imperfections that there might be. Dry is fine as long as you really make sure everything's clean. No pitting or anything like that, which these ones cleaned up really nice, so honestly, probably don't even need this sealer, but it's a good peace of mind. It looks like this little bearing race installer is gonna fit the bill. Let's drive her on home. There we go, now we just go do that a whole bunch more times. There's a few different sizes, pretty self-explanatory. So I'm gonna go around and do that and then bring you guys back. Alright, so they're all in. Unfortunately my kit came with an extra 35mm and one less 30mm. So the one core plug back here sitting behind the flywheel, I still need to get one. Luckily parts stores sell them for like $1, so we'll do that before we put it in the car, but we're good to go for now. We can go ahead and start dressing up the side of the engine. We can start off with the coolant line that goes across this side of the block. So here is the whole setup. This line actually pulls out. There should be an O-ring in here that we're going to want to replace. There we go. So this housing here just goes like that. Got a gasket here. These are going to get torqued to 14 to 18 foot-pounds, just like the water pump. Alright, so now we can replace our O-ring on this tube here. This one's not even in that bad a shape, but might as well replace it. Lube her up a little bit. There we go. I almost forgot, we can go ahead and get our valve cover on now. So we need to deal with this rear cap on the exhaust cam. If you've got an earlier 1.8 or 1.6, then there's a cam angle sensor that goes on here. It's kind of like a distributor, an electronic distributor. We don't have that here, so this cap is going to go in that place. It just pushes in there. But we need to go ahead and put some sealant around here since this is exposed to the outside. So we just need a little skim coat, nothing crazy. And we'll also push our plug in and we can just tighten it down with the cap. Alright, so before we put our cover on, we need to put some RTV at the corners of every bridge. So on either side of here, here, and here. Just do a healthy dab. Then the gasket just pushes in. It's like that. I don't know why. If this is a different style gasket than this cover takes or what, but it's in there, so we can go ahead and set it down. Then we just got a whole bunch of these 10mm bolts. Alright, so now we'll just tighten these all down to not very tight, just so that the rubber gasket compresses against the aluminum. We'll want to go back and forth evenly.